All right.
Oh, official.
Um, so I will.
So do we have to click continue then?
Um,
I
I
did.
think so. Yeah. Just saying that
Okay,
you're okay with it.
yeah.
All right. So I'll start by sharing my screen. I want to start by talking about the difference between prophecy and promise. And most of this in the next section are from a theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, who's one of my favorites and one of the more popular of the 20th century. And he talks a lot about God's promises. And he talks about the difference between prophecy and promise because it's not something a lot of people think about, but there is a real difference there. So the first difference is the events of prophecy are not created by those who prophesy. It's people just telling the future. Nostradamus is not causing any of his great prophecies to come true. He's just saying what's going to happen, similar to a weatherman doesn't, or weather person doesn't create the weather. Whereas a promise, the person who promises is the one who does what was promised. So God's promise is we know that God is going to do. The next difference is a prophecy has no influence on future events. Again, with that comparison to a weather person, they don't control the weather by predicting it. They just say what it's most likely going to be. And the only thing that really affects is the people hearing the prophecy. It doesn't change the weather. It maybe helps you prepare for it. But a promise is what is called a speech act. The speech of the promise creates the action that was spoken. So it creates something in the world by its very existence. For the last comparison, prophecies are interpretive and promises are performative. So prophecies just interpret events again, and promises perform those events. They create something into the world, so to speak. And does that really strike anybody, any of those differences? Does anybody have any thoughts about those?
Well, promises are performative if somebody keeps their promise, right?
That's true, yes. Yeah, and I only cut out a few of the comparisons, but another thing about promise is that they need to be kept to remain promises. And yeah. And then according to Moltmann, there are several characteristics of the promises of God specifically.
Punch.
God promises but does not prophesy. God is a God of creation. God does not say what's going to happen that God has no control over. God says this is going to happen because I'm going to make it so. Another thing is, compared to other gods of the ancient world, God's unwavering constancy was unique. Faithfulness is God's very nature. So a lot of the gods around the same time that Israel was forming and the Bible was being written, they would say one thing to another. They would be happy one day, or they would say they would do something and change their minds all the time, and honestly didn't even really care about people. And that's because people used ancient gods to kind of explain all these things like weather and things like that we have no control over and that just seem to happen no matter what we do. But God's not like that. God says something and sticks to what God says. Another characteristic, all of God's promises point to God's coming kingdom. Thus, all of God's promises point beyond themselves. So it's not just God making this promise and this is going to happen. There's a purpose to all of God's promises that point to the kingdom. However, since the kingdom has not yet come, there remains a contradiction between God's promises and reality. And we'll see that a lot in the promises we're covering tonight. God will make a covenant or a promise, and years, hundreds of years even, sometimes will pass, and the promise will not come to be, and that can cause problems for the people. But in the meantime, we have signs, wonders, and in our experience, the Holy Spirit to sustain our faith in the promise. And yeah, these just keep us in mind that the promise is on the way, and in the Holy Spirit, the promise is partially even fulfilled. God's promises are relational in nature. They describe how God will be in relationship with God's creation. We'll see this tonight in the covenant. Covenants in the ancient world were usually more contractual and described how two people of lesser power, or a person of greater power and lesser power, would be in relationship with one another, but it was very obligatory and not very relational, and basically just focused on power dynamics. But God's promises are not that way. God's relational promises are never over and done like prophecy or lesser promises. God will always be ours, and we will always be God's. So you think of a promise we make, and we either do it or don't do it, but once it's either done or not done, that's it, it's over. But God's promises are for all time. God promises the impossible because God makes the impossible possible. We see this through creation out of nothingness, fertility out of barrenness, life out of death. God brings possibility where we don't see possibility. And finally, God's promises deliver more than we have ever experienced, and so deliver more than we can expect or know. The term for this is superabundance. God's promises, like even the covenants we'll see later tonight, go beyond what we can imagine. An example, God promised David that his line, a king, like his line would always be, and the ultimate king would come. But most people consider that a human king, but we realize that as the promise of Jesus. So yeah, these are just some of the characteristics, and just kind of look them over and pay attention, and we'll keep those in mind as we look at the different promises throughout the Old Testament. Does anybody have any thoughts about promises? Any of these characteristics they want to push back on, or any other characteristics not listed that they think about when they think of promises of God?
Well, I don't want to get off onto a discussion, but just the fourth bullet point where it says there remains a contradiction between God's promises and reality. I think sometimes it's really hard for me to, I want to see God's promises unfold in a temporal way now, in a sense. And
Yeah.
doesn't mean I don't believe all of that, but the reality is sometimes seems contradictory, but for sure.
Yeah, I think we'll see that a lot too in Scripture too. That's one of the main things. People don't believe the promise of God, or they don't see it in their reality in temporal time, and so that's really hard. Definitely see that. Yeah, so tonight I kind of wanted to look at the covenants, which are the major promises in the Old Testament. Now, there's 4 major covenants, promises in the Old Testament. There's the covenant God made with Noah after the ark. There's a covenant with Abraham, the covenant with Moses, and the covenant with David. And just some things to talk about covenants. They're a promise from God and a requirement of reciprocity from the people the covenant is made with, similar to contracts. Unlike contracts, however, only God can revoke a covenant. We'll see it again and again throughout these covenants. If humanity does not live up to its part, which it won't, God still remains in the covenant. Because again, faithfulness is part of God's very nature. Covenants are relational in nature. I touched on this before, which is why both parties contribute. Because if it's just got one-sided, that's not much of a relationship. Relationship is you're back and forth with a person, you're both contributing to the relationship. And that's why I see some of the conditions that we see with God's covenants. Biblical covenants start out broad in scope, and we'll see as they go along in the Old Testament that they become narrower and focused with each new covenant. And where the new covenant, which will not cover tonight, we'll just kind of end on, but that once again opens up to all creation with the promise of Christ. In the ancient world, covenants were official agreements between a greater and lesser party that define the relationship. While God's covenants are based on these ancient models, they are not about power dynamics, but relational dynamics. So yeah, does anybody have any questions about the covenants?
So you can't have a covenant of equal parties?
Not in the ancient world. They were typically between like a ruler and their vassal. So a king and a governor, or one of their subsidiary rulers. And they were usually to the effect that they will pay tribute to me, and if someone attacks them, I will come to their defense, kind of thing. Which we kind of see in God's covenants, but again, they're more relational than power and political. We're going to start with Noah's covenant, and I'll read first, unless anybody would like to take a turn to read. We'll all have a chance to read if we care to. But this is from Genesis 9, a little context. It's right after Noah's come out of the ark with his family and made, as far as scripture goes, the first burnt offering. And this is what God says to Noah. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and see the bow, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all the flesh that is on the earth." So the first covenant establishes God's relationship with all creation, in which God vows never again to attempt to destroy all the earth. So as I said, they get narrow in focus as they go along. In this first one, pretty broad. It's with all of creation. And unlike the other covenants we'll look at, this covenant's unconditional. It requires no reciprocity from the other party, which is creation. This is just God's promise to once again protect creation and keep from destroying it again. So some questions I had, or if anything else you want to talk about this passage. How does this covenant apply to us today? What hope can we find from this promise? Or what does this covenant tell us about God? And now I'll stop sharing so we can see each other in discussion. But yeah, if we want to talk about this for a while.
Well, I guess God lets nature continue to evolve, but there's a lot of species that were there at the time of the Old Testament that aren't here today because they've become extinct. So maybe it wasn't with all of them, I don't know. It's not the same that it was then, and we've lost a lot of species that were once here. And I don't think he made a covenant with the dinosaurs. But they were gone by this time, right?
Well, I picked up on the word covenant is relational. Is that what you're saying, Brent, between God and creation? But in this particular one, it seems like, and I know it's different as we get down maybe to the others, but it's like God promising to creation. It seems like right here, creation isn't required to to even accept it or to agree or to say, thank you, God, or anything. It seems one way, right? In this particular discussion, that strikes me based on the word relational. But
Yeah, it almost reminds me more of a peace treaty than a covenant. Like, we've been in conflict and here's the terms I'm setting up and you don't get any say in it.
So if God makes a covenant, but if something outside, like if an asteroid comes and destroys the Earth, now God didn't create it, but that could happen because of the
Or didn't God create
the
it?
natural sciences, natural. So would God just say, well, that wasn't me?
Yeah, and I've always questioned, like, I noticed the thing, I will never destroy the earth again by flood. I'm like, does that leave everything else open?
Everything else open, yeah. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I think of it
There was,
as,
there was also
oh,
the
go ahead.
understanding that the words of the flood were chaos. The waters that separated the heavens and the earth was the concept of chaos, which you could include a whole lot in chaos.
Mhm.
Yeah, does anybody kind of see how this covenant can apply to us today?
Now, that's what I was just thinking about. And I was thinking, it's hard to see. I mean, when you think of things going on today, be it wars or racial tensions or all kinds of things.
Yeah, and I know I said that it was one-sided, but really I kind of do see it as two-sided because it's also our responsibility not to destroy the earth. And
Yeah, climate change.
Mhm.
How about the hope that is offered in the opposite of being cut off? The promise to never be cut off, no matter how
Yeah,
wacky
well,
we get.
yeah,
that's good to be
Yeah,
made aware of.
that's-
Yeah.
that's a promise that it's reassuring.
yeah, does anybody have any thoughts about what this covenant tells us about God?
Is this an example of God's compassion that God feels then, and
Yeah,
I will never again do this to you or do this to creation? I
right.
don't necessarily think it means regret, but
Now, I was thinking generosity, but I like your word compassion better, Bev.
I think it tells us he wants a relationship with us because he values it to the point of making a covenant to be there for us always.
Yeah,
The word that comes to my mind is faithful. He's faithful, and that
Mhm.
is reassuring to me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So does in the Garden of Eden, when God said the seed of the woman shall bruise the serpent's head, is that a promise or a covenant?
I don't think that's an official covenant. I think it's more of a promise, or a lot of times it's kind of the result of our disobedience, which is slightly different than a covenant. It's more of a effect of our cause of disobedience, which we'll see with when we get into Moses and the law, and we talk about that a little bit. Yeah, if y'all are ready, we can move on to the next covenant to talk about. All right, so the next covenant is the covenant between God and Abraham. And now it's talked about, as we'll see in the highlights, a few times in several chapters, but I'm just taking a section that really encapsulates all that God promised to Abraham. Does anyone care to read?
Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
So this is the initial promise from God to Abraham, who eventually becomes Abraham, which precedes the covenant made later on. And in it, we see that God will do two things. God will make Abraham into a great nation through his and Sarah's descendants. And second, that God will bless all of humanity throughout Abraham. And then after Abraham doubts God's promise, the covenant is officially made in Genesis 15, where God promises the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants, and God makes it official. And finally, in Genesis 17, the covenant is ratified, and the responsibility of humanity, or Abraham in this case, is that he has to have his entire house circumcised. It's funny, the linguistic of the word covenant means cutting. You're cutting out an agreement between you and another person. So I always kind of get tickled when I see that circumcision is the first sign of this covenant. But also we see that God's covenants are transformational, because God also gives Abram a new identity as Abraham. So just some questions I have for this section. When have you doubted God's promises in your own life? The scope of the covenant narrows from all creation to humanity. So Noah's was all about all creation. This is a covenant for all humanity. We will all be blessed through Abraham's descendants. Another question, do you feel God answered that declaration of doubt? And why is God so accepting of Abraham's doubt? And I'll stop sharing and post the questions again in the chat.
So can you ask that question again?
Yeah, the first question is, have you ever doubted God's promises in your own life? Not even maybe specific promises, but just doubted God's presence or activity in your own life.
Well, I'm thinking about now, we just finished about Thomas, the doubting disciple, and all the things with the resurrection. And of course, it sounds like it would not happen. And you always have heard and before that if something this good, if something sounds this good, it probably isn't true. And I think that that's something that we probably have to battle all the time. Sarah, she was so, old and thought, well, I'm not going to bear any sons or anything like this. I'm too old. And so to get beyond being able to say that, yes, I think that this will come true, we as people, as individuals, we've been kind of taught if something is too good to be true, it probably is. And then I guess that, and there's reasons that that is true and maybe is a safeguard for us, but it hinders our belief.
Yeah, I think that's one of the tricky things, because we see promises to each other a lot of times, and those are very human in their nature. And they often get broken, and yeah, it's really hard to have faith. And Abraham, his faith is raised above most later on, and he was still doubting. He said, look, it's been dozens of years. I'm over 100 now. My wife is over 100. And where's my child? And God's response, instead of like, you don't believe me, but God's response was actually to deepen the promise into a covenant.
Well, and just for me, just the last year or so, I mean, I suspect I'm not alone in thinking sometime, God, where are you? How much pain is inflicted on the world or the United States or whatever.
I don't know if it's the same thing as I don't like, I don't think I really doubt God's presence or promise in my head, but there's sometimes, and maybe it's because of what I hope my prayers have the power to accomplish, but God feels so far away, so deaf. And I know I'm not the first person. I sometimes read it in the daily devotional. Someone will, on a particular passage, will say, where are you, God? You're so, seem so silent, so far away. And, guess that's doubt.
But there's also the hopeful part. I mean, we know we're not going, we have an X number of years to be here. But if we feel like that God's promise will be kept, then I think there's a sense of hope that even though we may not see it during our time, let's continue to keep in mind that promise and to keep working towards it. And I think that that's a way to have some hope also, and feeling good about, well, things will be all right. I responded to Dean Phillips. He writes me all the time, and he wanted me to complete a survey about how hopeful are you that what's going to happen. And there's no other way I can hope but hoping number 5 being the highest, 1 through 5, highest being very hopeful. I think the minute that you don't have that hope, it's not going to work out. And it's not going to work out, maybe, as long as I live. But I think that's the way we have to come and try to solve issues, is that, yes, there is an answer. We might not see it, but with God's help, it will be all right.
I like to think that where our hope runs out, that's where God's waiting for us. And that's where God a lot of times steps in, at least into my own life, that those darkest times and where you're just about ready or about the end of your hope.
I like that. Where hope runs out, that's where God sits or stands.
It's helpful to know that once the covenant is made, if we or the humanity decides not to keep it, God will keep it. Because, Sarah didn't think it was possible, so she gave Abraham Hagar and says, I don't think this is going to happen. And yet, God kept his promise eventually. But so it's God's covenant with the descendants of Hagar as well as Sarah.
Yeah, God had his own promise to make to Hagar when Sarah kicked her out and sent her into the wilderness. God promised Hagar that he would be with her, which is actually a really beautiful moment. I recommend that story as well, because it's one of the few times God speaks directly to a woman in the Bible. And yeah, it's just really compassionate and heartbreaking scene almost. But that's a great segue into our next covenant, because we're talking about doubt, and we'll see some in this next one for sure. Yeah, so that brings us to the Mosaic covenant. Would anyone like to read this passage?
Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites.
Okay, so this is when Moses leads the Israelites to Mount Sinai, and where they receive God's new covenant and become God's people. This is just a huge moment for the people of Israel. The Keystone event, they came to Mount Sinai as a ragged group of fugitive slaves, as the Hebrews, with no collective identity, and they left Sinai a united people claimed by God. Through this covenant God makes with Israel, they're to be a chosen people, not for their own glory, but as a priestly nation for the benefit of the rest of humanity. There'd be a model, a shining people. So we see the scope of the covenant narrow even further here to a single people from humanity previously. Now, the covenant was given before the law. A lot of times people think that Jews have to keep the law to remain people of God, but it's actually reversed. The law is a result of having a right relationship with God. So after Israel immediately breaks the covenant through worshiping the golden calf, God shows grace by restoring the covenant. So yeah, as soon as they get this covenant, again, we see the people doubting. They're saying, well, God said he'd be with us, but he's always up with Moses on the mountain. We need a God we can see and who's here with us. So let's make a golden calf. And God sees this and, is heartbroken, but still just restores the covenant with all the same words and all the same demands on the people. Yeah, and so for this part, I just kind of want to explore, how would you feel being an Israelite on Sinai, knowing that you are now called to be a part of a holy people? serving as priests and models to the rest of humanity? And conversely, how would you feel seeing as priestly people from the outside? How would it work? So I'll stop sharing and post the questions or any other thoughts on this. This covenant covers, I think, 5 or 6 chapters in Exodus, which we can't go into the full thing here. So I just chose that selection, but it's a pretty major event.
Well, I think what the outside, inside part, the Gentile, the last question, when I read
Mhm.
that, I thought of white privilege.
Mm.
And it reminded me of today.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Would you speak again, or, because now we can't see your notes, but where this, you say the law, excuse me, the law, since it was given after the covenant, the law is the result of, did you say,
Yeah.
how did you word that?
So a lot of times we tend to look at, say, the letters of Paul and his talks about the law, and we think of the law as all these things that people have to do to be right with God. But that's not how Judaism has traditionally seen the law, or Torah, as they call it. For them, it's the proof of a right relationship with God. So if you're in a right relationship with God, you will follow the law naturally. So if you're breaking the law, something's not right, and you need to kind of work on that relationship. And I think that's what a lot of the laws are really about in the Old Testament, at least in that Jewish tradition. So it's not more of our modern understanding of the law where you have to follow these or you're in trouble kind of deal.
So the law was given at some point, but people's obedience or keeping the law is witness to the relationship that they have with God. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's how I understand it.
Well, if you are a Gentile and you heard that, does that mean that you're not the chosen people? You're not of the lineage? You're not going to be a priestly kingdom? You're, and then so that's kind of that's that.
Yeah, you're
That's Old Testament.
like the
right?
Palestinians. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm talking about this time that this
Was written.
that was given.
Yeah.
And that's kind of hard piece to swallow. I mean, if it would be other people saying that to you, but if it's God saying it, you're going, well, I guess I can do what I want to do. I don't know. I mean, I'm just not one of the in crowd.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was that people back then didn't see Israel's God as the one true God. One of my professors said that back in those times, gods were kind of like sports teams. Every city had its own major god, and
Yeah, that's true.
wars were all about my God can beat your God kind of thing. So, and I think that's kind of the idea here, is that God is showing that these people are different through the law. And so you see that this God is different than your typical gods. But you also see when Israel comes in contact with foreign nations later on that this is a big sticking point for other nations. Like, no, you don't worship your God, especially in the exile with Daniel and other people. You need to worship our God now. So, yeah.
I mean, that came with his first promise to Abraham. When he says, I will make of you a great nation, all of a sudden there's the gift of it, that relationship with God is unique way back then. So was God then adjusting to what the people did in relation to the relationship? It's almost like he gave them the 10 Commandments because they went the wrong way with the golden calf, and he stopped them from going into Canaan until they were ready. And so it's like he's going to make it happen, but he's kind of tweaking it along the way, depending on how they follow his principles, you know?
Yeah, and that's a way to look at all of these covenants as kind of an evolution of God's relationship with humanity. That's kind of how I've always looked at a lot of the Old Testament's like progressive narrative, is that God keeps trying things with us and it's not working, so keeps trying new things, and then, as we'll see, eventually just becomes human through Christ. And yeah,
And that's when the
we're-
covenant changes. So then all the Gentiles are included.
yeah.
Well, God is always creating. So I suppose when humanity fails or doesn't keep its part, we keep our part of the covenant, then God has to create some other means to help us along the way. So, and you think about the Genesis covenant, that was creation, but he's always creating and he always will create.
Yeah. All right, we're running a little short on time here, so we'll just kind of briefly go over the Davidic covenant, and it's just read it and kind of go through the bullet points. Does anyone want to read this last covenant? I'm happy to.
Yeah, I can read it.
Oh, thanks, Donna.
When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever.
Yeah, so a little context for this. This comes after David promises to build a house for God's ark to dwell in, which God's ark is basically God's physical presence in the world amongst the Israelites. And God responds by promising to build David a house, in this case, a dynasty. And as Christians, we believe that God is foreshadowing that Christ's incarnation here. And we see the scope of the covenant narrow even further from a nation to an individual line, which is David's. But like I said, that goes through Christ, which, as we'll see in weeks to come, that will open up to all creation. Again, God's transforming of creation through what God accomplished in Christ. And interestingly, this is the one instance of covenant that is not foreshadowed or promised earlier in the story. Noah's covenant was promised before the flood. Abraham, as we saw, God promised before he made the covenant. God promised to make Israel a people before Mount Sinai. Here, it seems God made this covenant spontaneously in response to David's promise. And since we're at the end of our time, we can take these questions and just kind of ponder on them on our own. Do you think God is capable of being spontaneous? What relational dynamics do you see at work here? What parts of this passage speak to you and what parts trouble you? And in lieu of prayer, I'm going to read one final promise This is from Isaiah 11, 1 through 9, and familiar to a lot of you. I'll read this to close us out. "A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and fatling together, and the little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." Now this promise I especially like because of its intercultural connotations, and as we saw, a deliberation has begun on the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial. And so I just like keeping this in my heart and thinking on this promise. Thank you all for coming tonight to our Bible study.
Thank
And
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
And
you for
your,
your thoughts.
Brent, will you be taping it next week too?
yeah,
Because
so
we're
this
gonna
will be a
at
3-week.
my condo board meeting next week at this time, so.
Oh yeah, I'll be
See
taping
you
it.
guys in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be taping it and posting it. Hope to see all of you next week who can make it.
Thanks.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, Brent.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.